Hello, and welcome to Automate Office Work, the show that helps you get started automating your office work. I'm your host, Justin, a tech-savvy lawyer. I started on the same journey you are on, and I'm here to help you. Today's episode is all about the repository. You can find the content for today's show at automateofficework.com/repository. This show is a podcast, YouTube channel, and a LinkedIn live event every Friday. Welcome to our live audience on LinkedIn. Feel free to leave comments on LinkedIn during the show. I'll also try to leave time at the end to invite anyone who wants to come on and chat. So today's episode is based on an article I've written up on the subject. You can find it at automateofficework.com/repository. I also have it on screen, so I'll be showing some great visuals from there. But if you are listening with only audio, I will try to paint a picture with words so that you don't have to follow along. All right, so the repository is often a major part of workflows, usually at the end, when all the work is done. There is often a need for a permanent place to keep work products and also metadata about the work products. This is a key piece that you need to nail down. All right, so what is the structure of a repository? At its core, an ideal repository holds both files and metadata about those files. Most people are familiar with two common ways that deal with these two things separately: a tree of folders that holds files, or a spreadsheet that holds columns of metadata. A tree of folders. If all you have is a tree of folders, metadata can be indicated by the names of various levels of folders. For example, you have contracts. Within there, there's a folder called 2025. Then you have a child folder, Western US, then California, manufacturing, vendors, metals, Acme Metals Inc. for a specific vendor, and then finally purchase number 32. Most people are familiar with working with a tree of folders, and so they can easily set this up and start saving files in an appropriate folder. A single person may be able to set up the structure that will best work for them. The first problem is when you have a file that can or should go into multiple folders. Multiple points of metadata apply to it. So what do? Do you place the file in multiple folders? If you do this and you have to update the file in the future, you'll have to make the update in all copies of the file. Also, this approach requires absolute discipline. You must use the exact same naming conventions and the levels of folders across all of your items. A single person might be able to do this, but what happens when you have multiple people working in the tree of folders and others don't have this discipline or don't know the exact naming conventions that should be used? Many teams face this struggle, and often chaos ensues. All right, so the alternative is to use a spreadsheet. Another way that teams use, instead of a tree of folders, is to have a spreadsheet that tracks data. Each item has its own row in the spreadsheet. Metadata is tracked in columns of data instead of a folder level with a folder name. Our above example of contracts, 2025, Western US, California, etc. Instead, it would be in columns. And I've got just a very brief spreadsheet. It shows in one row, you've got these columns that just say the titles of the categories. You have year, region, state, division, role, industry, name, and contract. And then in the next row, you have the values of these. In this example, it's 2025, Western US, California, manufacturing, vendor, metals for the industry, Acme Metals Inc. for the name of the vendor, and then purchase number 32 for the contract. Now, let's say that a column should have multiple values. You could put the multiple values in separated by commas. So, for example, if we had multiple industries, we didn't just have metals for the industry, but we also had something like lubricants. You could put metals, comma, lubricants, and put that in your spreadsheet cell. Or you could also break out these possible values and give them their own columns. So instead of having just a blanket column for industry, you'd have one column for metals and then another column for lubricants. And then in those cells for the values, you might have like a checkbox or the word true or some kind of an X or something to let you know that yes, this contract and this vendor are in the industry metal, and they're also in the industry lubricants. So in my example on the screen, the boxes are checked in here. People are familiar with Excel and can easily start a new spreadsheet. This approach allows new columns to be added easily. but you may have to then go to already added rows and fill in with the proper metadata, so all rows are properly tagged with metadata. This approach makes it much easier to work with metadata. Small teams can better use the proper naming conventions for all metadata. The main problem with this approach, though, is that it is very difficult to attach files to a spreadsheet. Not impossible, but a spreadsheet quickly becomes difficult to work with when there are files inserted. Plus, what if there are multiple files in a contract and we want to maintain something like a tree of folders? So the best of both approaches. SharePoint blends both these approaches to give you the advantages of both in a document library. A SharePoint document library creates both a tree of folders, but also to the right of each folder or file is a spreadsheet-like interface with columns of metadata. We can thus apply metadata to the root folder of each item. Clicking on an item's folder reveals that you can create a tree of folders and files within. We could also apply metadata to these child folders and child files if we wish, or not. We could just apply our metadata only to the root folder. I've got a note here that you should create a new root folder for each distinct item. In other words, you should put each contract in its own record with its own metadata. For example, you should not put two contracts in the same record because each contract will have its own separate metadata, like its own unique start date and end date. Even if they have the same metadata to start out with, contracts can be amended in the future and could thus have different metadata in the future. So it's best to keep them separate from the beginning. This is a good practice for any kind of spreadsheet. Spreadsheets should always have a one-to-one relationship with their contents. Each distinct item should have its own row. Is it okay to put all my records for everything into a single document library in SharePoint? No, please don't do this. You should categorize your records into their own distinct document libraries with appropriate columns of metadata for each. Contracts should go in their own document library. Employee onboarding records should go into their own document library. Do not just put these into a general library called documents. Some notes on the limits of SharePoint. SharePoint has a couple of limits that you should be aware of so we can best work with it. Number one, a document library can hold up to 25 million items. An item is a folder or a file. If you are going to generate a lot of items, you might consider splitting your data by year or something similar. You could have a different document library for each year. Number two, SharePoint creates a tree of folders, and each folder can hold a maximum of 5,000 items. This limit applies equally to the root folder of your document library. A way that I get around this is by creating a folder in my root folder called folders. I then create a subfolder inside here called 1. My system, when creating a new item, looks for the highest numbered subfolder, and it sees how many items are in it. If there are less than 5,000 items in the 1 folder, we're good. It creates my item there. If, however, there are already 5,000 items in the 1 folder, it creates the next subfolder, folder 2, and it creates my item there. Folders, our generic folder, can hold up to 5,000 of these numbered subfolders, and each subfolder, which is numbered, can hold up to 5,000 items. So 5,000 times 5,000 equals 25 million using this system. Problem number 3. A single SharePoint has a maximum of 30 million items. If you need more space, you might consider just creating a new SharePoint to hold the data, or create a retention plan and delete your data when it is old or no longer useful. All right, let's talk about retention. You may also wish to think about retention. How long do you need to keep data? You may have legal requirements, so keep those in mind. How long is it valuable to keep an expired contract? Perhaps 10 years after expiration? SharePoint can have automations associated with it. So perhaps you have a metadata column for expiration, or you could already calculate and have a column for deletion that is the expiration date plus 10 years. The automation would then look each day for items with deletion dates equal to or before today's date and either delete immediately or flag for an admin to do a manual review and delete. To delete or hide, data can be very valuable, especially when looking for trends over time. Let's say you're tracking litigation and you want to remove litigation items that are closed. You could delete all data immediately, or you could create a metadata column called hidden and set it to true for cases that are closed. This would allow you to filter and show only hidden cases when you want to do trend analysis. I recommend that you do not delete items by default, but to flag them to be hidden instead. Saving work product and background files. At a minimum, you want to put the work product into your repository. You may want to store both a docx file and the signed PDF, but what about all the background information? Emails, charts, notes. You need to make it very clear and keep them separate in your repository. Finished files, I would put either in the root directory or of the item, or create a folder called finished or work product. Background files should in either case be put into a folder called background. Within the background folder, you could create an entire tree of folders for emails, charts, and notes. Getting data into the repository. What is your plan for getting data into the repository? Who will do it and when, and at what stage? At the latest, all files and metadata should be put into the repository at the very end. But what if your organization doesn't have discipline? What if sales gets signed contracts and doesn't want to put all the signed contracts into the repository like legal wants? The simplest method that requires one extra step with no technology. Here's a simple old school solution that doesn't require technology. Hire a contracts manager. Then require sales to email every single signed contract to this one person. Then you train this one person to tag all contracts appropriately in the repository. If I were this person, I would absolutely not want to read through every single contract to extract the metadata from it. What can we do instead? Attach a cover letter to every contract that specifies the metadata of each contract. The contract manager then simply reads the cover letter to tag the contracts. Okay, so now we push back the cover letter with metadata tags for sales to fill out. Can we trust that sales has been trained properly and will be motivated to extract the metadata appropriately? If I were sales, I would be comfortable with the metadata related to my business terms, but legal terms, they're confusing and legal should be managing these, especially since in negotiations, sales depends on legal to manage legal terms. So we can push these terms to legal when legal is working in negotiations. When a lawyer makes a change in the contract, they should update the cover sheet metadata. How do we generate this cover sheet and fill it in initially? The intake step. A lot of the data we need when generating a contract is actually metadata that needs to go into the cover sheet. And we need these exact points to generate the contract. So why not do both steps at the same time? Ideally, the business requester should have a request intake form where they fill in the exact data points we need to generate the contract. Type of contract, legal entity, details of the other party, start date, end date. They submit the form and a contract is created. And the metadata is tracked immediately in our cover sheet. No need to extract it at a later time. Minor tweaks are then created as things change during negotiations. What I've just described, the best situation for you depends on your organization. No matter when the metadata is extracted and put into the repository, it is absolutely crucial that you do it by the end at the latest. It's up to you to decide if you want to manage the metadata at earlier steps. What metadata should we capture? There's a balance between usefulness and complexity. Let's say you only have one data point of metadata. Yes, it's incredibly simple and easy for users to track this one data point, but it's also not very useful. On the other extreme, let's say you require users to track 1,000 data points. It could be extremely useful. You could do all kinds of filters and queries to create all kinds of charts and spot trends, but your users are also not going to like the process. They might start refusing to cooperate. So I would suggest you find a happy medium. Perhaps start out with the most useful 10 data points that are common to all contracts. Perhaps you even identify extra data points that are useful for certain kinds of contracts. Like a distribution agreement might have extra fields like territory, product list, minimum quota. The key is to keep it simple and yet useful enough. Some notes about AI and data extraction. Can't we simply have AI mine all these data points for us? You might want to try this on historical data. It's mostly not needed if you use my suggestion for an intake system. Extraction after the fact is not that useful if you already have the data points during generation. Another thing about AI, it can only get things that match patterns and are fairly obvious. Human language is messy. This is why the common answer from lawyers is, it depends. Things aren't always so clear and need human judgment. One example is if a contract has a country whose law governs the contract. You might have a data point for this, but what if it's absent from the contract? Just accidentally missed? Or what if it says something like Soviet Union and that country just doesn't exist anymore? Another example is the granularity or specificity of the metadata you're trying to capture. Let's say you have a data point called exclusivity, and it can be set to true or false. Exclusivity is not just a blanket thing. People in a contractual relationship can have different kinds of exclusivity. Exclusivity can be manual or one way, also called unilateral. When exclusivity is one way, who owes exclusivity to whom? None of this is a simple true-false. So beware of these issues. All this is to say that yes, AI can be very useful. It also has its limits. Be aware of its limits and try to use it appropriately. At a minimum, there are some data points that AI will never be able to extract from the document. Data points that are not in the document, like who in the business owns the contract, or who in legal worked on the contract. These are very important data points which you should be tracking and not depend on AI to glean for you. All right, some final issues. Updating records. Things change. Perhaps your contracts get amended. You should have a process for when amendments are signed. If the amendment changes a data point in the parent contract, the metadata of the parent contract should be updated. Whether you do this in a manual way or in an automated way. But keep in mind that amendments do not update the parent agreement simply when the amendment is created. You have to wait until the amendment is signed. You might run an automation that is triggered when the amendment is fully signed in an e-signature platform. Even in the case of a human going and manually updating the metadata of the parent agreement, you might want this to be on the cover sheet for the amendment. Have a field for which parent agreement the amendment is modifying, and have a table for the metadata fields that will need to be updated in the parent agreement, and the values they should be once fully signed. All right, and lastly, bringing it all together. Having the right repository is crucial. There are many issues to consider, but now you are empowered to create your repository with intention. In the next show, I will show you the ideal repository that I created. It is accessible in both Outlook and SharePoint. So I welcome you to come back next time, or just go to the next episode if this is already in the future. My name is Justin. I am a techie lawyer. Feel free to contact me, connect with me on LinkedIn. Also, you can find me on my website, automateofficework.com. I am available with consulting services. I can provide solutions. Some of the solutions I'm going to show you next week, which can be customized to fit your work exactly the way you need it. I'm also available for education services. If you would like for me to be a speaker to your group or at a conference, I can give practical tips because I have been there. I was a corporate lawyer for 10 years, but before that, I studied computers and linguistics, and I have put all these skills together to just automate the hell out of office work. So, all right, let's see if we were able to get any comments from the live audience. All right, it does not look like it. No live comments. All right, well, feel free to reach out to me. We are I'm happy to have people come on as guests. We can have a conversation and discuss your specific situation, show people how to really go through and find these processes that can be improved, and give you specific advice on how you can do it. All right. So I wish everybody another happy week and happy automating. Bye, everybody.